series of sessions that we have had on economic growth. The motivating factor, as you know, was the Prime Minister talking about India 2047. And then we thought it will be important for the foundation to put on record with the best minds who were involved in the reforms earlier to discuss about the fundamentals, the basics of reforms and moving forward. In a country so complex like India, it's never easy to do reforms. And we have had, fortunately, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Pani Garia, Dr. Virmani himself speak to us about reforms. And today we have invited none else but a towering stalwart, Mr. Dr. Kelkar, to speak to us. Next week we have N.K. Singh. So, Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare in the last 3 years that we have come into existence has been making efforts to provide research-based policy advice to all the stakeholders and the government. It is in this very context, starting from COVID, we shifted to the webinar series, and since then, we have been very fortunate to bring in from across the world academicians, policymakers, even Nobel laureates to come and speak to us on contemporary issues. Continuing with that same line, we have the discussion today. To chair the session, we have our chairman, Dr. Arvind Virmani. Dr. Arvind Virmani, as you would know, was the chief economic advisor of our country after working many years in the Planning Commission and before that at the World Bank. He was also the executive director at the International Monetary Fund in Washington. He has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals. He has books to his credit. With that, I would now like to invite Dr. Arvind Virmani to take over and chair the session.
Thank you. Let me start by kind of giving a brief formal introduction to Dr. Vijay Kelkar, and then kind of giving a short personal interaction, because part of that, as he told us, he would like to have a discussion, and it's always nice to have a little personal touch in these discussions. So I think what is quite interesting about Dr. Kelkar is that his diverse interests and experience. And if I just list out some of the recent stuff, you will get an idea. He has been president of the Indian Statistical Institute, chairman of CSIR Tech Private Limited, chairman of the National Stock Exchange of India Limited, chairman of the Forum of Federations Ottawa, where he was a trustee from 2014 onwards. He has been chairman of the India Development Foundation, which to my memory, I think he actually founded or helped found. He has been more recently vice president of the Pune International Center, which he set up. He was chairman of the 13th Finance Commission. He has been chairman of IDFC Private Equity, and he has been advisor to finance minister in the rank of MOS in the 2002 to 2004, and executive director monetary fund before he became finance secretary in 1998-99. Now, with that kind of gives you an overall idea of many diverse interests he's had. Let me give a more personal introduction. Well, we happen to share one unique feature. Maybe it was unique at that time, perhaps not now, which was that we both started as engineer by doing engineering and then moving on to economics. I think there were basically 3 to 5 economists of that generation who took the engineering route. The point about actually that is that both of us have shared a great interest in technology, technical change, and R&D. And some of the things which Dr. Kelkar has done and the commissions he's chaired, which are not mentioned here, involved those aspects. And perhaps we will get some of his views on that later on in the discussion. The other personal point I want to say is that I think he's had the right balance between theoretical understanding and pragmatic practical experience, and an intense sensitivity to everyone, and which gives him the ability to motivate people. I mean, in my experience, to get them to do the best out of that. And I've seen this, from well before he became my boss in 98, 99. And what I remember from that time, which really shows his character, I was in finance ministry and planning commission for a decade before that time. And I still remember that Dr. Kelkar, who was a secretary during that period in other ministries, always used to drop in to see me. He was always interested in both the theoretical aspects, what's going on, fiscal. I remember many discussions with him. So his kind of illustrates what I just said about him. And if he doesn't mind, I'll tell us a small story, which is kind of funny and and trivial in some way, but very revealing. So in one of these discussions, we were sitting in my office. He was either leaving and dropped in, or was coming in and dropped into my office, and we were discussing something. And from my memory, which is probably not very correct, he stops and he says something like this: Arvind, do you mind if I give you a little piece of advice? I said, no, I'm happy to have your advice. And he looked down on my pants and he said, always wear a belt on your pants, because if you ever burst your buttons, you won't be embarrassed. And I've had this in mind ever since he said this. It must be like 30 years ago, but it illustrates, both his sensitivity to the people he talks with, he works with, and also his very pragmatic approach, to everything. So with that, let me turn to him to give his opening remarks. And as Vijay, as you indicated, I think that's an excellent idea, that let's start with 81 and maybe come up to 98 if you want to come. Before we go to, my approach from there will be to look at this second generation reform paper. Sorry, I should have mentioned. Then, of course, he became my boss in 1998, 99. And really, I am very grateful that he urged me, supported me, corrected my draft, and this incredible monograph came out of it, which is called Second Generation Reform, which I'm going to use as a kind of template to discuss policy reforms from then on, from 1999 onwards, to elicit his views on various issues. But let me first invite you, Vijay, to give your thoughts and observations on the period before this, from 80s to, let's say, 97, and what you thought during that period, what you think looking back, etc. So over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Let me first thank EGROW Foundation for Economic Growth Foundation for inviting me for this very prestigious series of yours, and also very generous and warm introduction by both Dr. Charles and, of course, my good friend, Dr. Virmani. I think I will beg indulgence of today's audience that because the nature of today's discussion, there's a lot of I is going to come, because I'm going to speak on my own experience rather than the theory. So something will come. So usually I'm not so egoistic. So, but today is probably, and Dr. Charan Singh allowed me that liberty to refer to it. So I will take full advantage of his permission. So I must warn you that it will happen. When we discussed about this discussion or today's conversation with Arvind, I felt that sometimes it's not adequately appreciated that yes, the reforms 91 was indeed of a different nature, different level. But it is also true that reform was started much earlier by earlier, especially early leadership. And I want to give an example of Mr. Rajiv Gandhi when he became Prime Minister, what he did, and because I have a little more deeper knowledge of those 4 or 5 years of what he did and what was the sort of his approach to reforms and which areas he emphasized. Uh, it is very clear that he was he initiated a large number of micro and mesoeconomic reforms. I mean, probably the macroeconomic reforms were not introduced at that time. Perhaps they thought it was not necessary, and maybe that was one of the problems which created later on. But his emphasis, as I see it, looking backwards, was in the major sectors, both agriculture and industry and infrastructure. Now I'll start with the industrial economy, industrial sector, and there one important tool he used as an instrument for not just planning commission, but the institution called Bureau of Industrial Cost and Prices, BIC, which was sort of the incarnation of Tariff Commission. And the successive chairmen of this institution were independent thinkers, independent professionals and technocrats. And government was extremely sort of that time, and that's what I to emulate that example, give complete independence to this institution. They had full right to submit a report in whatever form they wish, whatever they were allowed to consult whomever they want, and they interacted, and more often than not, their proposal found a way in the policies. And I'll give a couple of examples of my. I had an honor of working there, but I'll give examples of my predecessors, like Dr. Alag, who was the chairman of BSB, and how he completely changed the one important sector, which is the petrochemical sector. It was a new rising sunrise sector. It was recognized by the Prime Minister that he wanted to give that new sunrise sector momentum. But Dr. Alag, through his reports, and persuaded to government and to move in this sector right from the word go on tariff-based incentive schemes. That means all prices where he said should be input parity prices, and which brought down over time. So it was the first sort of concrete use of trade policy for the domestic industrialization. So it was a very, very interesting idea. And if you remember, petrochemical became a leading sector at that time in the economy. In fact, in later years, myself, Rajiv Kumar, somehow showed our somewhat unhappiness for neglecting metal-based industries, but that's a different story. But that was a major innovation was made. Second innovation he made was in the sectors like in agriculture. He was also been chairman of the Agriculture Prices Commission, and the entire agriculture pricing system, which includes markets plus the policies of using incentives for modernization or technology change. So third area in which, if you remember, Rajiv Gandhi introduced through arrival of Sam Pitroda, telecom reforms. And people will tend to forget the complete sort of sea change was brought in by Sam Pitroda by inducting technology to C dot. And I remember in the 80s, C dot was at par, but maybe slightly ahead of Huawei that time. That time, China also just introduced similar kind of technology, similar kind of reform, and San Pedro we were ahead of it. But of course, then we just lost out. The other so sectoral reform like telecom sector was very important. Agriculture sector was the whole use of the fertilizer industry, fertilizer sector, which was done together because that was not done by Dr. Alag. By using whole fertilizer pricing, he introduced the concept of what we call not cost plus pricing, but normative pricing. And he called this LRMC, long run marginal cost basis. So he introduced a lot of rationality and which led to better investment decisions in the economy. So I think and his predecessor was Lavraj Kumar. So Lavraj Kumar had sort of made a beginning, and then of course my distinguished predecessor, Dr. Allied, and with full support from Minister of Industry and Prime Minister. There was absolutely no hesitation from the Prime Minister and the Finance Ministry and the sectoral ministries to go along because, as Arvind mentioned, BICP as an institution was very consultative. It consulted everybody, all the stakeholders were consulted. Everything was in a transparent manner. They created draft reports, consulted. So transparency plus consultation and plus knowledge based. And it was completely based on the sort of analytical techniques then contemporary available. Uh, uh, for instance, when I was asked by Sam to do something with telecom tariffs, we use and then later on they introduced non-linear prices because the telecom service have very interesting features. So we did introduce the non-linear pricing for pricing of telecom sector. So a number of reforms were taking place in those times, which were done with deliberate sort of policy objectives that they are all driven internally. I mean, they are not driven by, none of them are based on World Bank reports or World Bank, they're all driven by the internal driving forces led by industry and the Prime Minister, and of course, that time Planning Commission and also Finance Ministry. Everybody was sort of willing to do it. So this is what I think, Arvind, to answer it briefly, what happened in the 80s. The 80s was there was a, not in 1991 like Panshin, but it was a great deal of movement of knowledge-driven policies towards more rationalization and introducing more markets in at many sectors. It was micro plus meso kind of economic reforms, not the macroeconomic reforms, which dominated in 91 onwards.
Sir, you are muted.
No, I'm not speaking. I just respond to Arvind's question. So I thought.
Yeah, sorry. So let me just add a few things on the 1980s before we go on to the 1990s. So the two big thing, in one of my papers, I had done actually a huge appendix where I listed, I haven't seen it for 10, 15 years, but it's there, where I listed each of the reforms and the intensity of different reforms. So I'm sure the ones you have mentioned would appear there, but I want to mention two which you kind of not mentioned. Obviously, we are talking about a personal perspective, so that's fine. So the two which I remember, which came up in my analysis were very important, was one was the Alexander Committee report on import-export policy and the liberalization with that started. And the second was the Dagli Committee report, which was even earlier, but kind of unrolled, a little bit before and after the 80s. The Alexander Committee was early after 1980. And what I just want to mention is my analysis of productivity showed that the key driver of aggregate productivity growth, the rise in growth which took off. I mean, many people may not remember that per capita GDP growth actually tripled in the 80s, almost about 2.5 to 3 times what it was before 1980. And at least this empirical research, the technical research, identified one key factor. This was the liberalization of capital goods imports. And the way I tried to explain it was that earlier they had been restricted to buy licensed imports of capital goods from the Soviet Union, the USSR. And when the liberalization took place, they could get higher productivity capital goods. And that made such a difference that it visibly raised the rate of growth of productivity of the economy. Okay, so enough of the 1980s. Let's move on to the 1990s before we come to the issue of second generation reforms. And just to set the ball rolling while Dr. Kelkar thinks about some of the important issues which came up from his perspective, actually, I have something during this period, Dr. Kelkar was, I have it somewhere here. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, Dr. Kelkar was Director, International Trade Division of the UNCTAD from 91 to 94. And he was Secretary PNG from 94 to 97 and Chairman Tariff Commission from 97 to 98. So before I turn to him to tell us a little bit about this period, where in a way you were observing from outside and a little bit distant from the finance ministry and the industry ministry, where some of initially industry, but later much in the finance came up. Let me just to give the setting from our why don't you go first and then I'll come in. So why don't you tell us from your vantage point, what is it?
Arvind, I must mention very interesting period when between the last years of Rajiv Gandhi Prime Minister. Before the Prime Minister went to the general elections, he called Venkataraman, who was just retired as the Governor of the Reserve Bank, and he was advisor of Karnataka government. Under his chairmanship, he set up a two-man committee. I was second member. So the chairman was Venkataraman, I was a member as chairman of BICP. And D.R. Mehta, who was that time Chief Controller, Imports and Exports, was secretary of the committee. He gave us full freedom to give up blueprint reforms. So his intention was, he was hoping to come back to power. And as soon as he coming back to the next his term, he wanted to launch reforms. So he asked us to prepare a report for him. Unfortunately, he didn't get majority, and Mr. VP Singh became Prime Minister. But Mr. Venkataraman sent our report to the Mr. VP Singh, which outlines both macro and micro reforms, and which, if I may say so, I think government would have at least looked at it or adopted it partly. We didn't require a fund going to the fund. But there was such sense of animosity for Mr. Rajiv Gandhi in the mind of Mr. VP Singh that he, just because this group was appointed by Rajiv Gandhi, the report was not even looked at by the government. And I think, in my view, India lost precious 3 years of launching much deeper reform than in much earlier years, because everything was just said later on inside the report, almost everything.
So what was the date of this report roughly? Do you remember? And can you give us a little bit
1988, 89.
Okay. And I presume there was a kind of macroeconomic stabilization element and some micro reforms. Can you give us just a flavor of what kind of stuff?
But because Mr. Venkataraman was there, there's a lot of the reflection on needed financial sector reforms, industrial reforms, and also trade reforms. And that time, the person who worked with us was Jayant Roy, who was that time Advisor of Commerce. So I thought it was a very good report, if I may say so. And but that's how unfortunately happens in our sometimes systems. Personal animosity got better judgment, and we lost 3 years of policy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So with that, let me now turn the discussion, as I mentioned earlier. I'm going to use some of the topics, etc., and analysis. As I mentioned, when Dr. Vijay Kelkar became Finance Secretary in 98, I think soon after, or I don't remember the exact month, but he asked me to produce this report on second generation reforms, and he was the driving force. So basically what I did in that, and this is available on the website, perhaps we can give the address, it can be downloaded. But what I did was I started by reviewing the first generation reform, looked at the transition, and then went on to outline the second generation. So we will go step by step. I'm just going to use it as a template just to organize the discussion. So let me start with the first generation. The important, because there are too many things, I don't want to take all the time, but basically there were two, what one might call philosophical approaches or elements of everything we try to do. Now, remember, the situation is that there is massive amounts of control on all aspects of the economy. So one element was to decontrol and create competitive markets for manufactured goods. So decontrol prices, production, investment, trade and distribution, import, export, technology import. So allow freedom from private sector where there can and are competitive markets all over the world, to give them freedom, but also to free up the resources. An important resource being finance. So that was the underlying, and as Dr. Kelkar has mentioned already, that his report and the earlier reports he had worked on in BICP, etc., tried to do it, but at a micro level. What this 91 provided us with an opportunity to do it across a much larger and comprehensive set of sectors. So that's a big difference. That is why 91 is thought of as such a big change. But as I mentioned earlier, the growth rate actually only went up by 50% or so per capita growth rate, even though in earlier times it had gone up by 2.5 to 3 times. Here it went up by 50% to double. I think it was a bit less than double. So, the amount of change doesn't always necessarily mean higher growth, but as you go higher and higher growth, incremental growth becomes more difficult. So first element, this decontrol, and then second element, providing the finance. So the financial sector reform. Now, one thing which is very unique about financial sector reform is something called asymmetric information and moral hazard. So all the reforms we did in the finance, or at least the conceptual basis in which I was involved, was to make sure that we simultaneously created regulatory organizations to make sure that this thing would not collapse. I mean, competitive markets in manufactured products was conceptually easier, and financial sector one had to be very careful. And practitioners and others didn't necessarily have that concept that because of these theoretical problems, and this is kind of an illustration of what I said earlier about matching theory where it's needed with practical and pragmatic. So one had to make sure you had the regulatory institutions and regulatory structures to ensure that financial markets functioned in this competitive way. So this applied to foreign exchange regulation, the dual exchange, etc., the FEMA we had done, financing and production, investments, needed loans, so banking reform, equity, debt, FDI, FII, etc. And then the third element, kind of initial start, we went very far in certain aspects of tax reform. So tax reform was another thing that was focused on during this first stage of reforms. A lot further on customs duties and tariffs, some very important measures on income tax, basically focusing on the rate structure, and then the beginnings of the indirect tax reform, where the first generation reform part of this second generation report actually mentions the central VAT as a starting point, followed by a national VAT. And we will bring Dr. Kelkar into this because he was responsible for dropping this word national VAT and putting the word GST. We'll come back to that. But this was the first generation, and there were some things happening, but very, very imperfectly on PDS and agri-distribution, the ECA, there were some steps taken and backward movement. There was some element of creating the agro distribution I mentioned, FTD, SEZs, some mention of labor laws, discussion there, entrepreneurship, venture capital, which is all there in this monograph on second generation reforms, electronic fund transfer. So the beginnings of the digital transfer, microcredit, asset reconstruction company. These were some of the issues which were in the part of the second generation and the transition to the generation before the second generation stuff started, which we'll take up next. But on these period from roughly 1991 to before you became secretary, would you like to say some of the issues which in your mind or you recall your experiences from that time?
But you mentioned Arvind about my stint at UNCTAD, and that really did influence me in terms of two things: the importance of trade reforms, and which is what to do, and second, what not to do in terms of. You see, before I went to Geneva, in our '89 report along with Mr. Venkataman and myself, and we were looking backwards. We were sort of great believer at that time about open capital market, opening capital market. But I think my work in UNCTAD taught me, as a famous statement of Jagdish Bhagwati, that capital is not like wicket, what you call, it's not like a good or product. You have to treat it differently. And that's one important. And I think in that sense, our 90s reform sequence was beautifully done. I mean, I think in terms of the started, we sectors which are, as I said, first was the capital goods industry, then we got intermediate. We end was consumer goods sector. And after real sectors were sort of exposed, then we started thinking about and working on financial sector. So in that sense, but speed with which we did real reform, real good economy, we were somewhat tardy in the financial sector, and for various reasons, I think. But I'm afraid that that delay has cost the Indian economy quite a bit in terms of being tardy in our finance sector reforms, and because that can give a major source of your second wave of productivity growth, which you're looking for, and will come from really efficient capital markets and efficient financial sector, and much more open architecture for finance sector. So you're right. So yeah. You're right that 90s were quite good. We did real economy, product markets, trade, and industry reforms, but we were somewhat tardy in financial sector reforms.
So we'll come back to the two key problems which you outlined. The issue of trade reform, which is of course very current now. So hopefully at the end of it, I should keep stock of time. But anyway, we have to come back to discussing where we go from here on the trade side and the industrial policy. And second, and similarly with the capital account opening, we can come and discuss that. But I should just briefly mention that, yes, I mean, again, that was the concept was very clear, both on the real side, and it wasn't just a matter of economics, it was a balancing of economics and politics, and this is why I mentioned your expertise in, combining what may be optimal theoretically with being practical and pragmatic, and these two are actually examples of that. The first one particularly, the raw materials, capital goods, intermediates and consumer goods was actually a strategy to combine this very clearly. I mean, we knew that there would be huge resistance to just opening everything. So this was, in fact, we had this discussion with Montek a few weeks ago, and I was very deeply involved in it. So we discussed those aspects. I mean, just to mention for your information, because you were out and in other places, I had to, every single tariff I had on my Excel sheet, and I had all the sectors, and I had the differentiate and so on. So a full picture I had to address this issue, problems, and the opposition which came up. Just to mention, people think it was very easy to do that tariff reform. It wasn't. I mean, one had to think about how to balance the resistance from different sectors, from different businessmen. I forgot to tell this story, but it's an interesting story. There used to be a businessman, and we were quite open to people coming. Of course, we didn't tell them what we were doing. There was a businessman who came to me for 5 years. Every year he would say, and if I remember, it was something called dead burnt magnesia or something to that effect. Every year he used to come and tell me, don't open this, we are going to die. And in the 6th year, he never came. And in the 7th year, I read in the newspaper that this industry is flourishing. So this was, you're quite right. The second part, capital, which we will come back to, and of course the incompleteness, I agree. The issue is very important even today, so we should come back and have your views on the further reform of trade policy or what is the weakness. But again, on the capital account, we were very clear about the sequence of short-term debt, medium-term debt, long-term debt, equity, and trade, current account, capital account. So all these different sequencings were clearly in our mind. Again, the question was not just the theory, I mean, like you very correctly pointed out, the theory has no sequencing. I mean, you open everything is good, anything and everything is good. So, the idea was really both to give time for industry to adjust. So it was not like throwing them into the water at one go. And secondly, in cases where there was a political view, how to overcome it. So that's right. So let's then move on. I hope you will, kind of recall some of your personal experiences from now on, because you were, perhaps the old days are too far, but we'd love to have your personal, like you gave us in those 2 committees you mentioned. I'm very happy you did that, because that's the purpose of this discussion, to flesh out what was happening from different aspects or different viewpoints. Okay, so let me move now to second generation reforms, which I repeat again, I really wouldn't have written this monograph, which I should show people who have not yet seen it. It's a little monograph like this, it's about, let's see, 100 pages, which, and one of the interesting things about it in that this one, I started by giving projections, and its second heading was from poverty to middle income. And for those of you who know, we have moved in the last 7 years or so, we moved from being lower income country to a lower middle income country. So we did make that transition in the 2000s. In fact, in the 2010s, about 7 years ago. So somewhere between, I don't remember the exact date, from 210 to 220. But what was this second generation? I mean, that's the interesting part. I mentioned things which were incomplete: agriculture, labor, etc. Maybe we'll come back. Some of those have started happening now. But the big change, the second generation, which Dr. Kelkar pushed me, it turns out, was the whole role of government. And there are many aspects to it, and hopefully I'll try to go one by one, but feel free to jump and shift from others. But we really would like to have, given your long experience in fiscal, etc., etc. But let me just read out the topics so that people have a picture. So the second generation reforms part of this book talks about the role of government in terms of public goods, quasi-public goods, and externalities, which determine what is called natural monopolies in infrastructure. It talks about the macroeconomic environment for private markets and private production, and it goes into some aspects of welfare and safety nets. So this whole range, And one of the important things which I'm very proud of now is I gave extensive coverage to law and order, justice, legal, judicial, and police reform. That is one of the important sections in the second generation reform. Then there are other chapters on or sections, because it's a small monograph, on macroeconomic environment. Independent monetary authority was proposed there. You know, we have now MPC. I didn't mention MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee, but Independent Monetary Authority. In that second generation reform, there was a proposal for statistical authority. Many years later, a National Statistical Commission was set up. Freedom of Information Act was recommended there. And again, you know that the Right to Information Act was ultimately passed. Fiscal Responsibility Act was proposed in that. Again, those of you who follow reform, the FRBM Act was eventually passed in 2004. So that is one. Then tax reforms. I mentioned SENVAT, National VAT, and GST, where I hope Dr. Kelkar will tell us more. He's been deeply involved in those times. Then customs tariff reforms was mentioned there, and tariff commission. Again, there's something Dr. Kelkar has large experience, so I'm sure please pick up these two aspects and tell us more. And then there was a proposal for corporate tax reform and personal income tax, the direct tax code. Again, a code was not mentioned there, but there was a concept of how to develop such a code was in that second generation reforms. Then the third aspect, public and quasi-public goods. What do we mean by that? Well, there are two types. There's a public infrastructure. There are two types. Public goods infrastructure, what we call natural monopoly elements. One of the big developments over this period and just before this period is that you could segment industries. Earlier, we used to think of whole infrastructure from end to end as one, but it turned out you can break it up into pieces. So this, the second generation reform volume gave a method of how you could segment it and what you needed to keep very carefully, perhaps in a public operation. Then strategic industries. We have the reforms now, but the whole concept, how to look at DPEs in railways, in telecom, etc., etc. And of course, PSE and public sector enterprises and public sector bank privatization was addressed in that. And then, of course, there was also welfare reform, like the employment guarantee scheme was proposed, which ultimately became NREGA and M-NREGA. I must mention here that even though this was proposed there, it was totally distorted by the time it was implemented. The emphasis there was how to merge and use private markets, private sector and government to produce an efficient and equitable result. But the MNREGA, which finally came out eventually, was a bureaucratic construction. You know, there was no reform made. They just went backward to the employment guarantee scheme of the Maharashtra government, which is what I had based it and modified it. Negative income tax, which we later called the net income transfer. So, and also the ideas of DBT, DCT, and others which emerged. We discussed some of these last time, so I won't go too deeply into it. The last few points. Public health, the importance of public versus what is called private health was emphasized there, you know, including health insurance, you know, as a supplement, as again, cooperative solutions that government does what it does best, and the private sector should be allowed to do and NGOs should do. This was the concept underlying this second generation reforms, and then basic education, training and skills. So with that long overview, let me start. We can, I'll turn it over to you, Vijay Babu. Let's start with any place which you want to. We can start with taxes or infrastructure or whichever area. We can go one by one, and we'd like to have your views and observations and experience on these matters.
Thanks, Arvind. I think you have given really, and when you that particular paper was very comprehensive foundation you provided for thinking about the reform is most useful. I think, fortunately, different avatars, what you said, has come out one way or other. So, if you permit, I take that as a starting point, and because as I see for the coming sort of wave of reform, what could be sort of
Sure.
what you mentioned can be taken deep and further.
Right.
I think over the years, I learned that all these reforms has one sine qua non, which is a very, very sound functioning, and this country, the complex like ours, strong and functioning political economy. And today, if you ask me, what the most sort of urgency of reform is really strengthening these foundations of our political economy. And here I mean the institutional reform, which are define the governance and the affect the governance. I'll mention three, which I think require, in my view, now require thinking. Probably has primacy, in my view, for succeeding or next wave. First is, I think, strengthening parliament, because pandemic and even recent war and Chinese aggression has suggested that India is going to be buffeted by shocks. And the only way you can withstand shocks is by making system resilient. And to make system resilient, you require good institutions. And good institution as starting point will have a parliament. We're going to find further strengthening of parliaments. For instance, I have a couple of illustrations I'll give. Then we don't have required debates now in the parliament on the issues which are required, because every policy reform requires consensus, and that can be forged only by discussions. So that's this to strengthen more discussions in the parliamentary committees. So we do strengthen the committee structure, and for instance, what my experience has been, and probably yours will be no different. Each bill, in my view, was improved when it went through committees. When parliamentary committees discussed the bills of the government, each bill got improved. So I think this parliamentary scrutiny is extremely important, and we have to make it robust. So this is one institutional sort of strength is required. A second part is that over the years, Arvind, people like you and me create a new sort of institution called regulators, and their governance, I'm afraid, are they're becoming substitute to the government itself, which are not accountable. So we have to find ways of making them accountable to Parliament, because amongst all the systems, I personally have great faith in Parliament to protect Indian democracy and Indian sort of freedoms. So we have to find regulatory system also come under much greater sort of oversight by the Parliament. So parliamentary oversight and the improvement of the regulatory system, and I include regulatory system, I include monetary institutions like the RBI or SEBI or the Competition Commission or the number of institutions, or even in some ways the institutions like CBI, institutions directed all the agencies which require the degree of parliament oversight greater. So that is really strengthen the foundations of our democracy. Because to my mind, precondition for next, because next reforms are going to be more difficult. What we did so far was picnic in terms of reforms. And the corollary of this would be a strengthening of our cooperative federalism. Because these countries become too large, too complex now. I mean, the intra-state differences are getting much wider. So we have to recognize the diversity of our states in terms of their problems. A Kerala problem development are very different than, say, problems in Assam or Bihar or Orissa. I'm talking about large states. So I think we require much better institutional structure for promoting. And here, Arvind, by sheer probably luck or maybe some design, we got a good possible model for strengthening that, like GST Council can be provided a prototype model for many other areas where federal system, cooperative federalism can be strengthened by, because that's real, becomes sharing of power between the states. I mean, it was a great vision. And I think the government of India made a great deal of sacrifice, and state government also, by sharing their powers. But it created a new institution where there's a power sharing, and I think it would serve well for a republic. So we require institutional reforms which really strengthen the institutional people's. I'm not going to make any comment on judicial reforms because, you know, Arvind was chairing Finance Commission. We want to have a full chapter on this, but my secretary of the commission warned me that it can be misunderstood, so we didn't venture in that. Because our judiciary is very jealous or zealous, not jealous, zealous of their rights. So we didn't touch, but time has come to look at how to do judicial reform because that's a very important part of governance. And today that's not really functioning to level it which needed to function. And I'm not pointing the fingers, but we need to do that. So I'm saying the next phase of reforms, not only the reform to mention your brilliant memorandum or the book, I think now needs to be supplemented by equally sort of second thing we're looking forward to you to come out by bringing out this reform institution, starting with issue of governance. I think we require far greater decentralization, fiscal decentralization. For instance, today our major states, Delhi, which is privileged. I live in Pune. I see that city requires investments, requires resources. Our fiscal system doesn't have that accommodation. So we have to think of this reforms which brings in the genuinely empower 73rd and 72 amendment, which was done 30 years ago, but we have not given teeth to it. So these kind of reforms are required. If you ask me, next waves of reform, we require impulse. Will have to be on strengthening of our institutions, because as today is very yesterday, a very disturbing article came from my friend Shankar Acharya in Business Standard, which is he's forewarning us. If you're not careful, what can happen? So our window is receding to act because of demographic. So-called dividend may become burden. So we don't have enough time, but we have to do a lot of things. For that requires political consensus. For that we require political processes. So I think this third phase has to be done. Dr. Virmani, we require your mind to be applied for this problem. Can you hear me?
So you're muted. Dr. Virmani, sir, you're muted.
No, I'm saying that now. Are I still muted?
Yeah, I got it. Okay. So I agree with you that on the need for institutional reform, I'm very happy you pointed out. I just want one clarification or elaboration. As you well know, the urbanization is going to be a key to future growth. It's one of the important drivers. You know, there are many projections which say that urbanization should go from something right now between 25 and 33% to 50 to 75% over the next 20 years or whatever. So the issue which comes up, and you mentioned Panchayati Raj. So urbanization, the Nagar Palika, you know, there is also this fundamental issue of decentralization from the state level to the urban level. I think India is one of the few countries where there is no kind of independent urban governance. So would you like to say something on that issue? The institution needed for that.
Can you hear me?
Sorry?
Can you hear me? Okay. So I think the famous formula of 3F, function, fund and functionaries. That's the way you have to strengthen the third tier. To require larger fund transfers. And I think one beautiful way of doing it is if we can, I can see a way of sharing directly, like we do with Finance Commission allows the states directly sharing with third tier the revenues from GST. Because GST is a consumption tax. GST sharing with the third tier. Sharing of GST with the third tier is a powerful way of giving funds. Once funds are gone, you will find the governments will be very happy to send up the functions also. Because if today the functions, state government would not like to do functions if there are funds. So funds goes, the starting point is the funds. Share the funds directly with the third tier.
Okay.
And GST, and let me just finish. GST is very interesting instrument because it creates incentive compatibility with both supply and demand for better governance.
Yeah.
Because it is a beautiful instrument. It's a beautiful instrument to improve governance, beautiful instrument to empower third tier, and that will start the ball rolling to what you're proposing.
Thank you. That's very useful. I think I hadn't. Yeah, I was going to follow up and ask you, but because from the state, as you well know, there are all these departments and there's no unified administration. But what you're saying is, once you pass the funds down, then some of this will become much more easier. That they will then delegate certain stuff to the.
Because many states like Maharashtra have a Jilla Parishad. We have a instituted district level political agencies. But so does Tamil Nadu, so does Karnataka, so does Kerala. So you can create these agencies, political agencies, but you have to empower them with funds. And the corporations also there already. Everywhere the major municipal corporations, you have possibilities. Agencies are there.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I agree. I think I take your points, but I just want to mention that one of the concerns is the big metros, right? As you again probably know, that in China, which is another federal, a large federal type of state, even their big urban centers are called districts, so to say. They are treated like a state. So for a large metro, I would say the top 50 cities in India, you would need a unified government. But I accept your point that once you give the funds, some of the other stuff becomes much easier. Yeah.
Bombay Municipal Corporation, if they get funds, they can organize. After all, with all the respect, government of Delhi, Chief Minister is essentially like a mayor, actually. It's not a government.
Yeah, Delhi is exceptional, right. But you're...
So it's the same model. Once you give them funds, you can get much greater accountability and performance, better performance.
Okay, great. So that was your suggestion. Again, to move it forward or put up some new issues, as I said, if you have other comments on the reforms, go ahead. But what I have here on future, there are 3 sets of kind of issues. Again, you may like to take up whatever interests you. One is kind of the old issues, which seem to be quite important for the future: electricity, distribution reform, and agriculture. Then the second set is, I'd put it together. We came across it earlier. The international trade, supply chains, PLI, kind of industrial and trade policy, where some people feel, perhaps you are among them, that it's gone the wrong way in the last, 4-5 years. And what's the right way if you think it's wrong? But here, I would point out that it's very important. I don't find any suggestions credible which ignore China's asymmetric trade, technology, and investment policies, which have, using asymmetric policies, created a monopoly. I recently looked at the data. China has 47% of the exports of all textiles, 47%. In my way of thinking, that's a monopoly. They created it. It didn't just happen. They have 33% of the clothing. They have 35% of the telecom and electronic exports. That's huge. So this whole trade and technology issue, seen from at least keeping China in mind. And then urban we've already discussed, but some of the new issues like Green India and digital. So these 3 buckets, if I would appreciate if you could comment on all these and what is your view and how do we proceed?
Arvind, I may sound like an old record, but to my mind, really by better, I mean, the immediate action on GST reform will go a long way in the electricity sector. Today, electricity outside GST. What happens? Then statutory board costs subsidized to high industrial prices of electricity, which in turn, our exporters suffer because they don't get set off against those prices. So there's complete problems are generated. So if electricity and energy sector brought in the GST, it will solve a lot of your problems, in my view. It will solve a lot of problems. Simple thing, it is that all over the world, it should be is a classic intermediate input. And that's one important way of solving electricity sector problem. Because electricity sector problem is pricing, essentially, which is a large and a double whammy because it increases prices for industrial sector, which knocks off their competitiveness completely. And then it creates a problem of fiscal stress on electricity boards. But that's one issue. The other which you mentioned was
Agriculture, trade.
the trade. I think we should follow the policy adopted by when during the Bajpayee's time. Mr. Bajpayee. It took barely Bajpayee's time. If you remember, they had pre-announced trade reduction reforms, which was then continued by Jaswant Singh Ji, was continued by Chidambaram as the finance minister, and that allowed our Indian economy to become much more competitive and exposed to the world market and reduce uncertainties. But I think we reversed it, unfortunately. We are unfortunately reversing our trade policy, where it became more protectionist, and that is, Arvind, you taught me that putting import duties like putting duty on exports. People don't realize that whenever you make imports more high duties which are not refined, essentially you are reducing exporting taxing exports. Classic insight from Lerner. So what is happening that because of the import policy, we are also further creating our own affecting competitive export sector also. So I think we have to go back to the era of Bajpayee and have a pre-announced reduction in our tariffs, because this protection import policy is not the way to promote the long-term sort of vibrant Indian industry. So that's why we argue on trade policy. Let's go back to Bajpayee.
Yeah, before we move on to the other topics, I just mentioned that, in 2002, I chaired a committee on tariff policy reform, which report is somewhere in the depths of the Revenue Department. It was a Revenue Department committee, which I chaired, where I laid out exactly what you have referred to. I laid out an actual series over the next 5 to 10 years of what to do in different sectors.
Arvind, you do some mining, get back that report back. If necessary, make some clear, bring it out.
Yeah, I have mentioned it in one of my pre-budget meetings, but I'm not sure anybody was interested in digging.
Publish it. I believe in more debate and discussion. You come out and publish.
So obviously things may have changed since then, and that can be modified, etc. But
revise it. All the ideas there. Please do it.
Right. Okay. So so we've done electricity and trade. Do you want to say anything on agriculture or move on to?
I don't know much on agriculture, but I mean, I'm really not expert. I'm not thought about it.
Yeah. Okay, green. What about digital revolution and green India? You have some thoughts on those two kind of things which are new in a sense. I mean, these issues were not much in the reform debate till recently. So
I'm a My instincts are like yours, more from as an economist. I think you have to price environment properly. We're not doing it. Just get the first starting point of the pricing of uh, environmental goods, environmental services offered.
Yeah.
Today they're taken as free, and we don't price it properly. Naturally, they get overused and misused. So let's get first, prices right, and also then technology. I mean, require both. Once price them right, technology will also supply will improve. And but environment again, we are not. I mean, look at the what's happening at least in Pune. I noticed what's happening. I'm sure it's happening in Delhi. They're not pricing things properly. Water, electricity, energy still underpriced.
Right.
Coal is underpriced. So I think by pricing we have to get it right.
Right. So if I may explain to our listeners, this is another, we've talked about infrastructure, natural monopolies, externalities. Now, environment in this way of thinking, which Dr. Kelkar is talking about, is a negative externality. That means it should be taxed because you're producing as part of, let's say, coal consumption or anything, you're producing harmful goods, carbon, whatever, which harms everybody else, the rest of us. You should tax that, okay, so that the social benefit cost is equal to the producer. And of course, the second aspect, which is the pricing of carbon pricing. So that is what Dr. Kelkar is referring to, that get the prices right. If you have an externality, tax it. If there's something you want people to use more, you can give a modest subsidy to improve utilization of a environmentally positive thing. Okay, that's great. So I do hope, I'm trying to jog your memory, but you have done a lot of work on R&D institutions, defense institutions, defense, etc. I mean, it would be really nice if you could share some of your memories and thoughts on those aspects with our audience here.
I think we have to change a lot of attitudes in the government about the private sector. I remember when I was asked by Pranab Babu, I was chairing a committee on getting private sector in defense production. And I had to sort of persuade that our civil servants, also public sector, that people private sector are as patriotic as you and I are. They're no less patriotic. We don't have a monopoly of patriotism just because we work for the government or public sector. So don't be sort of assume right from the first day that private sector is a problem. So I think we have to look at, learn to look at private sector in a different, with a different frame of mind. Otherwise, defense production is such an enormous possibility of really harnessing our Indian talent, which is there in private sector. And it's really pity that we ended up in the last 10 years increasing imports rather than producing domestically, which could have been produced domestically. So private sector is there in a number of areas. So I do believe that we have to much sort of better understanding of India's private sector. I think they are willing to come, they are willing to, but we must give a proper set of incentives, a stable incentive. I think stability of incentive is extremely important for private sector want to come.
That's a very important point. And before I go on, I'll ask you next on R&D, how to incentivize R&D or what to do about it. But on this point, I do want to tell a personal story which I've tweeted about. This is about 13 years ago. A very good friend of mine who I had not met for 12 years told me this story. He a small scale fellow who developed the communication and control systems for the Air Force. The managing of aircraft from the Air Force stations, the monitoring, the communication, and management, the whole. I don't want to go into details because these are kind of classified stuff. But he developed two major aspects of this whole system. And after he had put it in place in, I presume, like 10 or 20 or whatever many places to demonstrate that whole order was given to a public sector unit. And the guy, he had invested so much in the R&D to develop it. He had developed a whole human capital base to do R&D and put this stuff into place because it's very, technical. And he had done the capital investment. And the guy went bankrupt because he had anticipated that he'll get more orders and be able to meet his huge investment costs. And he went bankrupt. And he's never got credit for this development. So this kind of illustrates what this very suspicious and lousy mindset. I mean, the guy was a real patriot. I know him very well. I have known him for 30 years. So this is what Dr. Kelkar means. We just don't appreciate and this is not one big company, this is not the biggest industrialist in India, which people keep talking. There's a small guy, a little fellow, who had the, inclination, the interest to do the investment. There was no other market. It was purely for the defense. Anyway, so that is the key. You have to trust the private sector. You have to give them the support if you want a indigenous defense industry. R&D is a difficult issue. I have struggled with it myself. We had this triple incentive in R&D, etc., etc. Yet people keep saying, oh, there's not enough R&D in private sector, etc., etc. It would be really helpful if you can give us some pointers or direction in which government could possibly, what government could do to improve things a little bit at least.
I think R&D government is not supporting enough. If you look at the government expenditure in all technology, dynamic economies, the most important university level research. The basic research is faltering. You cannot have a good applied successes unless you have a solid foundation in university research. So I think time has come to look at strengthening our university departments, creating the basic sciences, like you have to create many more university of sciences. So invest in creating the top class scientific department. That's the starting point. There's no quick fix in R&D. It's based on science. Our science is weak. When you strengthen science, then strengthen give incentives, of course, to the later fiscal incentive R&D. But universities, I think, I've seen this happening in our own sector, Arvind, that our university economics department languishing because we give money for this institutions, we don't support the universities. ICSR support ICSR has dwindled, for instance, in social sciences. Same thing. So I think starting point has to be university. I'm sorry, it's not a simple solution. We have to give much greater support to universities, create strengthen science department. Our labs are outdated. We don't have the equipment. Look at the problems of scientists have. I mean, so I think we have to give much more resources and take some risks. I know it will take time. There's no quick fix for Ireland, in my view. It's a long term.
Okay.
But
okay, thank you. With that, I want to invite his Charan or other Dr. Visham Das, Charan, anybody here? Charan Singh?
Yes,
I question and answer. We still have time.
Yes, I would like to firstly thank. We have had a very good discussion and dialogue between both of you. So my problem is that I'm looking at distilling the lessons. You've been at the helm of reforms, and I'm so happy you mentioned that from 80s. So you've been watching those reforms from 1980 onwards. Now we have another model right now. You yourself said that the set of reforms from now onwards are going to be difficult and challenging. And if we are very, very honest, we saw what happened to agriculture sector reforms. Though you said you're not an expert there, but we saw that what happened and there was a setback. Now, so my first question is that what would be your guidance of taking the reforms forward, the difficult ones that they are. We are looking at the reforms today. If we look at the reforms of 1980 when you were at the helm and 1990s when you were the finance secretary, it is 25 years ago. And now we are thinking of India 25 years ahead. So what is the lesson in the next 25 years? This will be the mantra. The second thing, sir, you very rightly touched on the private sector. I have myself been saying that public sector will not be able to give you jobs. The 5-year plans are over worldwide, not only in India. So private sector has to be now accepted as a brother or as a and shoulder to shoulder. They will have to, or maybe they should take the lead in providing jobs. So how do we ensure that the paradigm shift, that the mind from always cursing the private sector to be bad, full of cheats, avoiding income, from that we change them to be partners with us in the growth story. So the third, you chaired the Finance Commission yourself. And I was wondering, and it's just happened that now the FM is saying that the fiscal council probably is not required. But the success with GST, the way they sit and settle things together and move it forward. So, and in the American experience of having a central, the budget office, which is constantly working, wherein you bring in all the issues of the center and state. What is, according to you, the way forward? Thank you, sir.
I mean, when you think about reforms, I think there are two models of reform, like maybe three, but I can think of two. One is reforms done after the crisis, when the crisis-led reforms, or one says of reforms in anticipation of crisis, that we want to avoid the crisis, which is consensus-led reforms. I mean, in a way, 91 reform was a crisis-led reforms, and the Vajpayee's model was consensus-led reform. There's no crisis, but he created consensus across the party lines and introduced reforms. So I think India requires consensus-led reforms. We have to discuss until you are tired. You have to discuss. People are not unintelligent. People are intelligent. If you respect the intelligence, discuss with issues, and discuss your solutions, I think you'll find much larger support coming across the wide spectrum of our society. So building consensus, taking every and also I think which is corollary of this is like saying federalism, because different states give different kind of solutions. So we have to sort of keep our ears and eyes open. As ideas may come from below. It's not that monopolies. Nobody has a monopoly of ideas, monopoly of innovation. So let it sort of flower. Let, as Mao said, let million flowers bloom, something like that. So a much greater consolidation, much greater sort of use a genuine federalism, where you allow. And as Dr. Virmani said, when you say federalism, it's 3 tiers, not just state, also local bodies. I mean, people stop at the second tier. I think we have to involve lot. First, I notice I'm involved with the one institute called Indian Institute of Human Settlement, which is expert in urban areas. So from there, I'm on the board. I can hear what interesting things are going in different states. So Bihar, if you allow states, so that's the second part in my view. We have to have the consensus-led reform. You have to do it in anticipation of crisis. Don't wait for the crisis to come. All mature economies behave that way. Mature economies don't wait for crisis to emerge, because the continuous sort of system of mapping, and they do a reform in anticipation of crisis. And third is what I learned is if you have a good feedback system, you correct your mistakes quite much earlier. So that's the advantage of consolidation. You create feedback loops, which allows you to make a correction, because you don't have at T0 all the solutions. So there's a lot of learning by doing is involved. You keep on sort of learning for what's happening. But you must keep your eyes and ears open, no more consultation. And finally, I would say that, and I'm sorry to repeat that point again, that now for reforms, you're going to require larger political consensus. So you have to have strengthened our systems of political systems of consultations, parliament, assemblies, the state assemblies, and that has to be, I think, far more vigorously involved in this exercise.
Thank you. Charan, do you see anybody familiar or?
Sir, your views on the fiscal council going forward? And as far as the views are concerned, there is one from Professor Vijay. He is asking us about the GST, and GST is not really benefiting the common man. And then there is one from Anjani Tripathi, and no, from Vijay again. Is in India economic reforms benefited more industrialists and not agriculturalists and common people?
On let me take this on the GST reform. I think GST reforms are now underway. I think if I had to advise the administration, I would have advised differently. My suggestion was that have a single rate, low rate, but single rate, because you increase the complexity of the system, and there the conceptual error I think Ministry of Finance has, in my view, when they implemented it, or GST Council has, they wanted GST reforms revenue neutral. That was error. Revenue neutral not at T0. Revenue neutral should be over time. Because reforms are investments. Any investment, capital investment, you get benefits over time. Not the same day you put a plan, you don't get same day all the returns. Returns over time. So major reforms should be considered investment. Don't expect at T0 it to be revenue neutral. And that created a problem. So conceptually, we got it wrong. And I think thinking of GST, had they done it, what I thought should have been done, many problems would have been sorted out. And it would have benefited because it would encourage employment. That's how poor would have benefited. If they would have got employment, larger incomes, larger economic activity. So I think GST are not anti-poor. They are people friendly, they're employment friendly, they're efficiency friendly. There's nothing inherent in GST which makes them against poor. It's how we implement it makes them problem. So that's why I don't know whether my explanation satisfies our friend who asked the question. But I don't think the GST as a design is anti-poor.
Yeah. So, okay, we have time for one more question. I don't see. Is anybody had raised?
Yeah. There's a question from Ms. Tripathi, I think. I didn't answer that question.
Okay.
What was that question? Can Dr. do you remember what the question was?
Yeah, I'm just reading it. There is one question, of course, on digital reforms.
No,
I don't know if you have a view.
I already asked him about digital. He is answered or not. I mean,
no, I think the second question was Ms. Tripathi.
Let me just see. I'm looking through the chat box.
Maybe she
Vijay Kumar, it's not Ms. Tripathi. I don't see. There she is. Oh, she's just saying thank you.
She's just thanking us for the talk.
Yeah.
You know, there is this question, and I think this is a genuine question which is there in the chat box, that did the reforms benefit actually the rural people, or it only benefited the industrialists? And did they benefit the common man, or it only benefited a handful of men? Is there a view on that?
I think
income inequalities is a standard thing even in the Western world. People talk about it. So I think it is the version that the I think Professor Kumar is asking that have you accentuated the income inequalities or have you just, they have really not yielded results?
Well, that's a different question. He's just talking about agriculture, but yeah, you can answer the two separate questions.
So, in fact, historically, the agriculture was the terms of trade were against agriculture. I mean, in fact, GST reverses that process by reducing the taxes on the industrial goods and making and opening the economy and reducing taxes. In fact, improved terms of trade ex ante, so improved. So I don't think those reforms are anti-agriculture. I think the whole reform base India first industrialization took place when we taxed agriculture. And that was whole debate between Charan Singh and Pandit Nehru. Charan Singh, as the chief minister of UP, quite rightly argued that you are taxing agriculture and helping through your trade policy, which was import substitution industrialization. But opening up the economy by making it tariff-led industrialization, in fact, in my view, analytically improves terms of trade for agriculture. So it was not anti-agriculture. Earlier policies were anti-agriculture. This policy is pro-agriculture.
So yeah, if I may just add to that, actually the reforms in agriculture, whether it's trade in agriculture, whether it's import, whether export, whether it's import of fertilizer, they are minimal. There isn't. So, I mean, you can't say there have been reforms in agriculture and they've not benefited. If there is no benefit to agricultural or rural people, there have been no reforms. So, what we have been arguing, both Dr. Kelkar and myself, is you need the reform before you can judge whether they are good or bad. I mean, we believe they'll be good, but you can't keep saying agriculture has not benefited when you haven't done any reform.
Correct.
I mean, that, and we know that very little directly connected with agriculture, including fertilizer sector. I mean, I mentioned in my second, I mean, this is like a first generation issue. Dr. Kelkar will remember Dr. Alag and he used to discuss fertilizer. I don't know when. I mean, 50 years ago. It's still not reformed. I mean, we are still where we were before. So anyway, so unless you actually do the agricultural reform and you do the reforms of the industries which feed into the agriculture or which benefit from it. For example, again, sorry to supplement, but I think it's very important because there are a lot of people who don't appreciate the textile sector. A reform of the textile import-export duty structure along the lines which Dr. Kelkar has suggested and which I largely agree with, simplification of the customs and reduction of customs duties on textiles, all textile products would benefit agriculture. So, both on the input side and on the use of agricultural products, there are still lots of reform issues left. I mean, for people who don't know, there are specific duties, which last time I counted 30 specific duties on textile imports. And you think that protects the textile industry? No, people misclassify because there's no way. Every product you can know exactly which of these 30 it is. So the inputs which go into textiles, they mislabel, and therefore there's no benefit to agriculture. So things like that. Anyway, we are coming close to our scheduled end. Unless Charan, you see any very important question. I have to thank Dr. Kelkar for spending 1.5 hours with us. Thank you so much. And it's good to see you again, Vijay. I've not been able to make it to Pune, but maybe this year or next year we'll meet again.
I want to make only final point, which you had raised, and also Doctor also raised, and some people also raised about the digital. Our experience has been that just introducing digital system in tax administration through tax administration network. Dr. Govinda's estimated the tax GDP ratio went up by 150 basis points. So you reduce compliance costs.
Say that again. What did we do?
TIN, tax innovation network, we introduced, if you remember.
TNI, TIN, TIN,
It
right.
is all driven by digital economy, digitalization.
Right, right.
That once innovation talks up, increase the tax GDP ratio by 150 basis points. Reduce transaction costs, increase widen the coverage. Evasion went down dramatically.
Right. So again, it's very important again for the public just to add to what you're saying.
Yeah.
To explain the GST, your argument for having a lower tax rate and single rate goes along with these TIN and other innovations so that everybody benefits, that government gets its revenue eventually. Yeah.
And conceptually, again, I'm making maybe a trivial point, but don't think when you do tax reform, revenue should be neutral at the right of the first year. Take reform as an investment. You're going to get return over time, much larger rate of returns. Single digit tax rate, GST single 10% would have given a much larger outcome than what happened.
Sir,
We've of course been on the same side on this issue for many decades, but it's good that different people kind of re-emphasize this. So I'm very happy you are doing that. Yeah.
Arvind, I realize that one of the intellectual error is to think it should revenue neutral. That's what the basic point was. Even mandarins in the Ministry of Finance were hung up on this revenue neutrality, revenue neutrality.
But the way, yeah, no, I agree. I think you put it very nicely, but it's the way I've started putting it is that you get a higher buoyancy. So eventually you'll get that neutrality.
But drop it neutrality, the word goes to 3-0.
But you're right. I think that's a nice way to put it. Treat it as an investment. Yeah.
Treat it as an investment. It's a capital investment. Reform is like capital, changing capital.
So one question I had for Dr. Kelkar, he's been the chair of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, means that's the biggest think tank on fiscal policy, and states and center, everybody comes there. Now, I was looking at the agriculture sector. I totally agree with what both of you are saying, the terms of trade. And we remember Professor Ashok Mitra used to say that the terms of trade are worse in agriculture. And then, of course, good research came out by Professor Mahendra Dev, who said they are improving. So I agree with you that over a period of time, TOT for agriculture has improved. But then we never have reconsidered when Professor Dr. Kelkar is saying that the tax GDP ratio improved. You know, it is still amongst the lowest in the world, around 17% of GDP. But in the meantime, TOT for agriculture improved. Why did we not consider taxing agriculture products or taxing agriculture?
But Dr. taxing agri income is very difficult administratively. I don't think we have capability to do it in a seamless manner. It will lead to a lot of harassment for compliance for many farmers. So I don't think it's good that we didn't do that. But certainly we can look at the commodity taxes. But income taxes, I would not advise. Too high transaction cost, and it's not worth it because you will really create a lot of angst amongst the large farming community. Not worth it. Not worth it.
Well, administratively, with so much of digitalization taking place, Food Corporation of India being the only.
Any case, constitutionally the state subject. You can't, government of India can't tax.
Well, I was thinking that's why I said the states and center both come to National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and I was wondering if that can help us improve our tax to GDP ratio.
No, I don't think that's a way I would start. I would start by agriculture income as a starting point. Look at the exemptions here. I mean, our exemptions at our current level per capita income are too high for you and me. Look at those first.
Agreed. I agree with you. Maybe the exemption limits on our income need to be revisited. Nowhere else in the world they are so high relative to the per capita average per capita income.
Things like this.
Really on the high.
Agriculture much to give. It's not worth it. You create more problems than you try to solve.
Right.
Acha, while we are, I think Dr. Kelkar is still quite comfortable. So let me ask him one more question, which I recall is quite dear to his heart. You have often talked about not product monopolies, but broader monopoly issues. I remember once, I won't mention, but you had urged me to do a paper on it once, and I never did it. But do you want to say something about that, the danger of monopolies, certain types of monopolies?
But for that we have to really. I'm sorry to say, but our Competition Commission has not lived up to expectation, and if we get our institution right, there is no problematic. But it is needed, and I think your kind of brain power has to be applied for it. What should be done?
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. As I said,
thank you for having me.
Yeah. Okay, I thank you and hand it over to Charan to conclude the meeting.
So I must thank both of you for this dialogue and must thank Dr. Kelkar to have agreed to accept our invite. We'll have the whole thing on air tomorrow. We'll release it on the air. So you're welcome to use it the way you wish to. Next week, same time, on the same theme, we are having Mr. N.K. Singh come and speak to us about the reforms. So I welcome all of you to join in this journey of understanding from the experts who handled the reforms earlier, so that going forward, we can distill some lessons and make the path easier for the next 25 years. Once again, thank you very much for all of you
Thank you very
to
much.
enrich this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.